their parent or their child who's off at college are going to get to vote. So we're all affected by this. And so building those coalitions that show that we're in this together as the American people and we're going to demand this. Sometimes the national media tends to cover the federal things a lot more than they cover state issues. Most of this battle is happening at the state level, not the federal level. And in doing so, we want to make sure that people understand to go to Richmond or Baltimore, I guess, Annapolis or wherever it is. Failing 5th grade civics about what's the capital of states. Go to your state capitals and make sure that you're building the kind of coalition that can say this is outrageous. There are certain things that should just be agreed on. And one of those seems to be the idea that everybody who has the right to vote, we should be encouraging them to vote, if not making them feel morally obligated to vote, and certainly shouldn't be making it harder to do so. Yes, ma'am?
So, do you believe that this should be a state issue or like a nation issue?
It's a great question. I think it is a state issue, first and foremost, because that's where it is right now. There is a federal issue with the Voting Rights Act, as we said, where a state has shown that it is incapable or unwilling to protect the right of its own citizens to vote into full citizenship. Then the Department of Justice has a role. So both of those things are there. The federal standard is there in order to make sure where these egregious patterns existed, that we have a right, or the courts have a right, to come in and demand otherwise. I think there's a broader question here, which is whether we have sufficiently protected the fundamental constitutional right to vote that we've talked about, and whether there may be room for greater federal action there. There are a number of issues we haven't talked about here. None of this addresses the issue about former felons having the right to vote. And different states have different standards. Some states are particularly, it's very, very difficult to get one's rights restored. That's traditionally been a state issue. But, and those are all important conversations to have. But even without getting into that, just talking about the folks who already have the right to vote under the law, this is the question of whether we reduce that franchise even further. So there are some federal questions out there, but right now the biggest fight is at the state level, and we want to make sure that all 50 states and territories are fully engaged in ensuring that we make it easier, not harder, to vote. Yes, ma'am.
So you kind of said that historically voter fraud hasn't really been a problem, but do eliminating these voter ID laws make it more of a possibility?
Well, there are plenty of ways that one can go after this if a pattern develops. The question is, do you make it more difficult before the patterns are there? As we've seen with these sting operations where people specifically try to go in and commit fraud, they haven't been able to because one way or another it gets figured out. And so the ID law itself is really just meant to be a barrier. It's not meant to be something that reduces a problem because the problem doesn't exist. If we saw a problem, you would want your solution to be addressed to that. Just like if you start feeling ill in your stomach, you just don't start taking every medicine you have. You go to the doctor first and figure out what's wrong with your stomach. And then you get a prescription based on that. So if a problem existed, then one would want a solution that actually addresses that problem, rather than just coming up with solutions to problems that don't exist that create new problems, not old problems. Yes, ma'am?
I'm just wondering if you can explain the direction of this conversation to me a little bit. Since you describe it as a barrier to voting, why the conversation has been one in which the liberals are on the defensive as opposed to maybe on the offensive, trying to, empower voters, like maybe via different electoral systems that make voting more accessible to people and make people want to vote more. Like that has been seen in other countries. Like why progressives are on the defensive to these, these reactionary policies as opposed to on the offensive, maybe in a different route.
Well, our think tank and others are thinking broadly about, how can we boldly envision democracy, not democracy 2.0, but democracy 2.1, the 21st century democracy, where if it's so easy for people to vote for American Idol, why are we still going through a 3-step process to be voting for things that matter a great deal more, with all due respect to American Idol? I don't even know if that's still on anymore, but you get the point. So So we do want to be thinking about that. And I think that's what was so exciting before, was that over about a 20-year period, we were coming up with more and more ways. One simple one was that when you, was the motor voter bill in the 90s. When you signed up for your driver's license, you automatically could register to vote at that point. Now that didn't deal with everyone, because as we've talked about, not everyone gets a driver's license. What about voting? You know, there was excitement for a while about online voting, and there was a lot of concern about potential fraud. Have we thought through enough of that? If you look at the Pacific Northwest states, they're doing a lot of vote by mail and are actually having much higher participation rates than you see, which surprised a lot of people, than you've seen in other states. So absolutely, this is an area where we should be experimenting about great new ways to make it easier for more people to vote, instead of having to fight a rearguard action on absurd, partisan, completely unprincipled efforts to make it harder for people to vote. We've obviously got to do that because we have some people who are willing to throw all morals and all commitment to democracy out the door to make it harder for people to vote. On the other hand, we have it. I'm getting the hook here. And I'm going to close up by saying one thing, Brian, if it's okay, or two quick things. One is, this was a fake press conference. I did